Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight's class is called Understanding the Pluto Formula. And what we will do tonight is we will look at the evolutionary astrology method of interpreting a chart. And this works basically with the planet Pluto, which represents the Sol, and the nodal axis of the Moon. And so I've taken 12 hours to teach this class. So I'm going to do it tonight in 2 hours. So we're going to get the condensed version of it. That's why you all have your handout, so that you can also refer to that information if you would like to. So I'm going to give you a lot of information tonight. As always, please feel free to interrupt and ask any questions if you want to. All right? And then also we will spend some time to actually work with this with George Bush's chart, which we've been looking at over the last few weeks. And so we can look at current events through his chart as well. But first of all, evolutionary astrology, as well as most other astrologies, work best when you work with observation and correlation. In other words, you look to observe something and then you correlate it to the planetary symbols. And when Jeffrey developed evolutionary astrology, he spent many, many years. He's interpreted something like 20,000 charts. So like he didn't just develop this formula out of his head and say, I mean, it came to him in dreams and everything, but he really spent the time working with it. And so what we're working with tonight is things that we've noticed through observation and correlation. And one of the basics with that we found is that souls have two main desires: a desire to separate from that which created them, and a desire to return to that which created them. And those two conflicting desires, to separate and to return, create each and every incarnation a soul has. And so souls will spend countless lifetimes manifesting, separating after separating desire, experiencing that momentary sense of satisfaction upon achieving a desire, which is then replaced with a sense of dissatisfaction. There must be something more. And so we'll go through countless lifetimes of that until eventually the desire to know that which created us, why am I here, becomes the stronger desire. And then eventually the only desire that's left. And so as we have worked with evolutionary astrology through this observation and correlation, we have found that the planet Pluto symbolizes the soul the most accurately. And Pluto will represent the soul on an individual basis and also on a collective basis. You will notice that when you look at the revolution of Pluto around a birth chart, it's approximately 248 years. It never makes it around someone's chart in an entire lifetime. It moves very, very slowly. So Pluto will spend anywhere from 10 to 30 years passing through a sign of the zodiac. It was the one with the most elliptical orbit and the one who was the most furthest off from that plane of ecliptic that we studied a few weeks ago. And so because of that, Pluto will find itself, again, taking anywhere from 10 to 30 years to pass through different signs of the zodiac. So what we have happen is whole generations of people are born with Pluto in one sign of the zodiac, and this becomes the generations of souls. We call them the Pluto generations. And this is a natural way to observe different generational characteristics within souls. And again, you can look at any ephemeris to tell this. Tonight, most of us, what we're familiar with is the Pluto in Cancer generation, which was from 1938-39 all the way up to 1956-57. And the Pluto in Cancer generation was a generation that was very much caught up in the karma of traditional male-female roles, and they came in to rebel against that and to learn how to have a gender equality, to learn the Capricorn opposition of being able to take care of themselves, especially on emotional levels. Again, with all astrology, you look to the opposite house, the opposite sign any planet is in to find the information. So as we look at these Pluto generations, we look to the opposite sign for the answers. Pluto in Cancer generation has Capricorn lessons. The next generation after that, 1956-57 through 1971-72, was the Pluto in Virgo generation, Pluto in Leo generation. Hold on, got to take this back. I apologize. From the late 19s up until 1938-39 was Pluto in Cancer. 1938-39 through 56-57 was Pluto in Leo. That was the long generation. So then this Pluto in Leo generation, this was the Me First generation. This was the generation that actually came in laying the seed thoughts for the Aquarian age because their polarity is Aquarius and they have those Aquarian lessons to learn of equality and detachment to see the larger picture. Leo, Me First. Aquarius, the whole group. How do I specifically fit into the picture? Then we have the Pluto in Virgo generation, which is 1956-57 through 1971-72. And the Pluto in Virgo generation is this analytical left brain generation that always sees the cup half empty and has to dissect everything to pieces. Their lessons are Piscean. They're the ones that have come at the end of the Piscean age to heal the wounds of the Piscean age. And their lessons are learning to rebirth spirituality, Pisces, to see the cup half full, to learn how to really experience unconditional love. And in evolutionary astrology's words, this is unconditional love from a natural law level, not from a patriarchal conditioning level. Okay? And then after that, we have the Pluto in Libra generation, which is 1971-72, all the way up to 1985. Pluto in Libra generation is a generational souls who came in with relationship lessons from their most recent past lives. And they usually had some type of relationship equality. They did not know how to have the equal giving and receiving in relationships. They had the Aries lessons, learning how to be an individual regardless of their relationships, learning how to be their own independent self, balancing the need for relationships with the need for self. And then we move into the younger generations that we have now. We got Pluto in Scorpio, 85 through 1983, 84 up to 1995. I'm trying to go too fast, is what my situation is. And the Pluto in Scorpio generation from 83, 84 to 1995. This is another generation that has some codependency issues. They are always looking sometimes for that power outside of themselves. The Scorpio, I have to be in control of my environment. And their lessons are the Taurian lessons, which are self-reliance lessons. And learning how to find an inner self-reliance so they don't have to be so controlling of their outer environment. And now we've moved into the Pluto in Sag, little souls that are coming along. And that's been 1995 up until 2008. And the Pluto in Sag generation, these are souls they've been searching in most recent past lives for their belief systems and what do they really believe. And with any of the generations, you can have them be from defending the past extremely to being the rebels. You can have the whole spectrum within any generation. So with this Pluto in Sag generation, we'll have those who are coming in at this time because they want a rebirthing of their fundamentalism to give them security. We'll have the little indigo children coming in under the Pluto in Sag generation as well. It's in either extreme, whether we're into religion, spirituality, anywhere along the spectrum, we're having to rebirth our belief systems. Those of us who are living during this time period with Pluto transiting through Sag since 1995, you will have noticed that you've been coming up against the limitations of your own beliefs. And you've been having to metamorphose those belief systems in whatever way. We do this on a personal level, we do this on a collective level. The lessons with Pluto in Sag is Gemini. And the Gemini lessons for this are the relativity of truth. In other words, there's many paths home. There's many ways to get to the same place. And none of us has the right to judge over another. Great Sagittarian example is learning how to be the teacher instead of the preacher. So we are all learning this in our personal lives, in our day-to-day issues, because our beliefs will affect everything in our lives. So this is Pluto through the generations, and so this becomes the backdrop. And again, Jeffrey's book, Pluto Volume 1, you can refer to that as he goes through the houses, and those houses correlate to the natural zodiac, and you can get a lot more information into these generations as well. Make sense? With that, sorry to go so fast. So again, in evolutionary astrology, we look at Pluto to represent the soul itself. All right, and so when we move from the Pluto in the sign then, and we move to a chart to look at Pluto in a specific house, that tells us the information of where this soul is coming from on some very specific levels. To this formula, there's actually 6 points to this formula, and I have them numbered for you. And what we call it in evolutionary astrology is the main karmic evolutionary dynamic. In other words, we're going to look at the first 3 points of this formula, and we're going to understand the main karmic dynamic that will exist within a soul. In other words, where the soul is coming from when you look at a birth chart. And then the last 3 points of the formula will show us where the soul is evolving. Why are they here? What are their next evolutionary steps in this lifetime? So we will look at one circle chart to get this information, and then once you grasp these 6 points to the formula, then you can add in the other planets in their signs and houses, and you can fill in the personality, the emotional nature, you can fill in everything else that's involved with the soul itself. Okay? One other tidbit that I need to digress into before going into the specifics of the formula, and that is working with another principle of evolutionary astrology that's one of its main foundations. And again, this has come through observation and correlation through thousands of charts. Although, you don't need the chart to know this next step. Evolutionary astrology also works with what we call the evolutionary states of the soul. In other words, as souls manifest these countless lifetimes, manifesting separating desire after separating desire and exhausting them until the desire to return to the source starts to become the stronger desire, they will go through different evolutionary states, so to speak. In other words, different levels of awareness of the whole picture. And in evolutionary astrology, we divide these into 4 evolutionary states, and I'd like to briefly go over them with you. However, first of all, again, I'd like to clarify. When you look at any astrological chart, there are 2 things it will not tell you. It will not tell you the gender, and it will not tell you the evolutionary state of the soul. That's only known through observation and correlation. So, as I taught to you about these different evolutionary states of the soul, you don't have to know any astrology to learn how to observe and discern where a soul is at in their evolutionary journey. Okay? These evolutionary states of the soul, there's 3 main ones, and then I'll talk about the 4th one. The first one is what we know as consensus state, or if you read Pluto Volume 1, Jeffrey actually used to call it the herd state. Basically because these were souls that would act however they were like being in the herd, and they would do whatever the leader of the herd would tell them to do. I come from a farm background. Whichever cow turned out to be the strongest denominator in the group, everybody else followed her. So this was also what the consensus state was like. The consensus state comprises approximately 70% of the souls on the planet at this time, regardless of their race, their nationality, the country they live in, the culture that they subscribe to. It goes across the board. Approximately 70% of the people in any country, in any race will be in what we know as the consensus state. And this is where the separating desires appear to be the stronger desires. These are the souls, again, who have not learned how to think for themselves. These are the souls where organized religion exists. These are the souls that if you tell them astrology is the work of the devil, they will have a tendency to take it as truth without checking it out for themselves. This is the majority of society. These are the people who have a tendency to be the leaders in our society. As they understand how this consensus state works, as they understand how any particular system works within their country and their culture, they will evolve to learn how to lead the people, how to lead their culture and their countries. So again, we call this a consensus state, and it's approximately 70% of the souls on the planet. Eventually, souls will evolve up into what we know as the individuated state, and this is approximately 20% of the souls on the planet, any race, any country. And these are the souls who are starting to learn how to question what is truth. These are the souls who are searching to think for themselves. This is where souls are starting to let go of what we would know to be organized religion and start moving into some of the alternative beliefs, manifesting lifetimes of many different beliefs in their search for what is truth. These are the souls that if you told them astrology was the work of the devil, they'd say, I'm going to go check that out for myself, thank you very much. Okay? Is this making sense? And this crossover from the consensus state into the individuated state, this is where those returning desires start to become more noticeable, more conscious than the separating desires. That the whole point about moving into the individuated state, this is where the soul starts to question, why am I here? What's the meaning of all this? What's my lessons? What's my purpose? That eventually souls will evolve up into what is known as the spirituated state, and this is approximately 5% of the souls on the planet, any race, any country. And these are the souls that are starting to understand universal, natural, spiritual laws and principles. They're learning to make their circle so large that they can include all kinds of belief systems, all kinds of understandings, and have an ability to realize the larger pictures of everything. And when we start to observe what we know as natural spiritual laws and principles, these are timeless, universal truths. These are principles, ideas, natural laws that stand the test of time. And most of these, well, all of these are observable through nature. All right, when we start to work with this. So again, the spirituated state is approximately 5% of the souls on the planet now. All right, this making sense? Now the fourth state is on the other end of the spectrum. This is called the dimly evolved or de-evolved state. And again, across the board in regards to race and culture, country. The dimly evolved or de-evolved state is approximately 5% of the souls on the planet. And these are souls who are either evolving up into human consciousness from lower kingdoms or outside of our solar system coming into this area, or they have de-evolved for karmic reasons. An example that I always like to share with people is someone like a Hitler, someone who would have to de-evolve to learn their lessons. All right? Examples of how you can tell the difference between dimly evolved and de-evolved souls. You can feel it in their auras. You can see it in their eyes. Many times when we're working with the dimly evolved or de-evolved state, there will be handicaps of a physical, emotional, mental nature. When you work with these people, you can feel, if you're working with the dimly evolved state and they're just moving up into human consciousness, there is an aura of unconditional love around them. They don't have the baggage that the rest of us have yet. And so you can look into their eyes. There's a dullness there. They're just learning how to occupy space and time and just learning how to function in the world. But when you get close to them, again, their auras are very loving. They're very unconditionally open and receiving. When you get close to those that are in the de-evolved state, their auras are full of anger and frustration. You don't feel safe within their aura. They also have eyes that are very hard and glassy. You look at them and you can feel their anger and their frustration at being stuck many times in a physically handicapped body, so that they have to come into the human realm and occupy space and time, and all they can do is think and use that brain in whatever ways, but they cannot get it, they cannot work in that physical world as they would like to. And the scenarios are endless in regards to this. So, this makes sense for everybody. This is one of the most natural things to understand about evolutionary astrology, because one of the most common things that happens in most of your traditional astrology is that somebody will look at a chart and they'll start looking at planets here and planets there and this stuff and that stuff, and they'll take a planet in a particular sign and they'll give the same interpretation to it no matter what the evolutionary state of the soul is. So in evolutionary astrology, one of the first things that we work with is we have that interaction with the client. One client will come to you and say, when am I going to win the lottery and become a millionaire? The next client will come to you and say, when am I going to have inner enlightenment? They can both have the same planetary symbols, and the different evolutionary states of the soul will have a different manifestation of the same planetary symbols. All right? So this is something that's explained in both Pluto Volume 1 and Pluto Volume 2, and it's something that you can learn to work with and learn to observe with people, and then, again, make this the beginning of what you start looking at with a chart. Just observing where souls are at. When I first learned this, I used to as I was going to the grocery store, going, to the different various places, and just having conversations with people, I would just practice. I would just practice through conversations with people, and I would know if I ran into somebody who, let me use these terms, born-again Christian, I was like, okay, they haven't made it to the individuated state yet, and you could learn to observe this stuff without having to know anything about them in regards to their chart. So in evolutionary astrology, we work to make that discernment with the soul, and then we start working to interpret the chart. So now I want to go back to the Pluto Formula, and the first point in the formula is wherever Pluto is by natal house sign aspect. That tells you where that individual soul is coming from by way of most recent past lives. So that gives you an idea of the lessons that soul has been working upon in its most recent past lives. All right? So we know that we can use that generational coloring by this Pluto in the sign, and then we can go to Pluto in the house. And what I'd like to do is just use George Bush as an example, because we all know who he is, and it makes it a simple example for all of us to work with. Now, let me just say, because I've worked with evolutionary astrology for almost 20 years, most of us in evolutionary astrology feel that George Bush is just moving into the advanced stages of the consensus state. You can take consensus, individuated, spirituated, and you can break them down into sub-states. Beginning, intermediate, advanced consensus, beginning, intermediate, advanced, individuated, and beginning, intermediate, advanced, spirituated. So George Bush is in transition from the middle stages of the consensus state up into the advanced stages of the consensus state. And many times you will see souls in that stage even into the beginning stages, transitioning from consensus to individuated souls can be in a transitionary stage as well. You will find them, again, wanting to lead the consensus state. Now, we won't all lead it as being presidents. We can lead it in a variety of different ways. We can be the leader of a bank president. We can be the mayor and the city council. There's some type of a leadership position. But when we look at George Bush's chart, most of us in evolutionary astrology, again, believe that he is just moving into the advanced stages of consensus state. So as we know that, then we also know from just that we have a person who is in those trenches, so to speak, of what we consider the traditions in society. All right? And we can know that by how we hear him speak as well. When we look at George Bush's Pluto, it's in Leo. So we know we have the Pluto in Leo generation, which means in most recent past lives, we have a soul who's been trying to find himself. The entire Pluto in Leo generation. Who am I? Why am I here? I know there's something special and creative about me. They're trying to find who they uniquely are. And so their orientation towards life coming in is still on that focus. Everything focuses around them. You remember back in the 80s we heard that me first generation? That was the Pluto in Leo generation coming into early adulthood and starting to make their voice known out there. So we know that that can be the generational background. So now we can take this Pluto formula by natal sign and by natal house. With George Bush, we have Pluto in the first house. This is the first house of the whole zodiac. This is the house that is the physical self. This is the house that is initiating new beginnings. This is the house that likes to have a lot of freedom. This is the house that has a lot of impulsiveness to us. So we have a soul, when we combine Pluto in Leo with Pluto in the first house, this is a soul who in most recent past lives has just had to be whoever they wanted to be. They wanted to break free. This is a soul who has a very impulsive nature coming in with that first house. And if you look at it by the fact that the ascendant is 7 degrees Leo and George Bush has Pluto at 10 degrees Leo, Pluto is only 3 degrees inside the beginning of the whole chart. So we have, because we're looking, again, the whole 12 houses, 360 degrees, and we're only 3 degrees inside that. In many ways, we have a soul that's trying to rebirth itself, and this soul doesn't know who it is. This is a soul that has a very Aries nature to it. Okay? And it's only through reaction from the 7th house, other people, that this soul has some idea of what their behavior's like. Classic Pluto in the first house, act first, think later. Okay, so we can kind of get some of this with this president. Okay, so you have this. In evolutionary astrology, I can do a reading and never even talk about the sun sign. I can go just focus in on the Pluto formula, give a depth of information to the soul. Because this is, for most of us, that soul operates on very unconscious levels. 75 to 80% of a soul's behavior is unconsciously motivated from the past, even in the spirituated state. So this gives us some idea of what it's like to decondition and break free from the past and move on. Okay, following this, just by looking at your natal Pluto by sign and house, you get a wealth of information. You can also then start to add in the aspects, and when you add in the aspects to natal Pluto, then you can get some idea of the things that the soul has been specifically working upon in most recent past lives as well. Okay? At this point, from this digest that I handed out to you, I want to interject something else that came in some of Jeffrey's later work, and it's not typed in there. So I want you guys to notice this. This would be like a 7th point in this formula, okay? So you want to, those of you taking notes, you want to write this one in. And that is that one of the other things that Jeffrey found through observation and correlation with charts is that we could determine how many lifetimes a soul has been working on a particular lesson by observing the phasal relationship that Mars makes to Pluto. Okay? So, Mars's relationship to Pluto tells us how many lifetimes a soul's been working upon those particular lessons. Do you remember, those of you who attended the Cycle of Aspects class, remember the 8 phases that we go through, the kind of, you can relate to them as the lunar cycle with the phases between the sun and the moon. We have new phase, crescent, first quarter, gibbous phase. Then we have full phase, disseminating, last quarter, balsamic phase. That was taking the circle and dividing it into 8s, the 8 different phases. Well, in evolutionary astrology, what we have found is a soul will spend approximately, more correct way to say, a soul will spend at least 8 lifetimes in a particular house before it gets those lessons. And it can spend more lifetimes than that if it doesn't want to learn those lessons. And so you look at what the phasal relationship is comparing Mars to Pluto. So if we want to look at this with George Bush's chart, remember you go counterclockwise to find to find the phase the faster moving planet is in compared to the slower moving planet. With George Bush, if we took Pluto as the stationary point and went counterclockwise to Mars, we only go 29 degrees. That's new phase. So what that could mean is we could a Pluto-Mars in new phase would be 1 lifetime. Pluto at 45 degrees from Mars would be 2 lifetimes. 90 degrees, 3. 135, 4. Those 8 phases you'd count around. So if it's only 29 degrees, we haven't even made it to 45 degrees yet. This is a soul who's only had 1 or 2 lifetimes with Pluto in the first house. So this is brand new for this soul. They don't know who they are yet as a unique individual. They're just beginning to learn these lessons okay? And if you want to compare Mars and Virgo in the 2nd house, this is a soul who can also have some very strong inner critical nature to themselves. Okay? Virgo, 2nd house, internalizing things. And if they're in consensus state, that soul wouldn't understand why they would be inwardly critical, and it would be projected outward. This would then be a soul who would project that criticism out there to others, not knowing that its source was deep inward feelings of inferiority. Virgo. Okay? This also could then have a reflection in that outer world of having an outwardly critical parent. A parent who would be very critical of the soul. When you have a first house Pluto souls, many times these can be souls who also, they'll come in one of 2 extremes. They'll come in very sure of themselves in the physical body, or they'll come in unsure of themselves in a physical body. And so this can be a soul who sometimes early on in childhood can not be physically adept, okay? And they stumble over their feet, or they get called clumsy. You know, and that impulsive nature, they'll start to go one way, and they get a brain synapse to go another way, and they can trip over themselves. You catching this, honey, with the first Pluto soul we know? So you can then find that these souls, you know, there's a self-consciousness that comes in here. And in the Pluto and Leo generation, this is going to get covered up with being that Leo boastfulness. And you relate it to this Mars and Virgo, okay, new phase. They're just going to instinctively, new phase, lash out and criticize others to feel better about themselves. So this is the conditioning that the soul came from in most recent past lives. And because so much of our orientation of souls is unconscious, we tend to repeat it. So then the soul will recreate this in the same environment early on, because the past, no matter how dysfunctional it is, represents security because it is what we know. All right? And we all do this at any evolutionary state. Robin?
So I just need to know if I have this correct, that everyone that was born in that time period would have Pluto in Leo, but it would be in different houses.
Exactly. Let's do another example of this, just so you can show this. Let's say we have a soul who's Pluto in Leo, but they have Pluto in the 4th house. Okay? If it was in the 4th house, this is the house of the Cancer house, the Moon house, the emotions. This is a soul who has lessons of emotional self-reliance. So they've spent most recent past lives coming from, most likely, family environments where there was extreme woundedness in the emotions. Okay? And so we could have a Pluto in Leo soul in the 4th house in consensus state that could be very emotionally insecure. Okay? Following how you do this? All right? And because of this emotional security, in that consensus state, they could either be someone who is low self-esteem and insecure and very quiet and very emotionally moody, or we could have a loud, boisterous person who would explode with every single thing that came along and upset them emotionally. Leo, you're not going to miss me. Okay? Do you see how you can then start to use it? And you can go through this Pluto in Leo, and it can be any of the 12 houses, having any of those 12 specific lessons within the generational lesson. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else following this?
How does it work in a solar return then? Is that...
In a solar return chart, you'll have an entirely new chart, and you'll have Pluto in a new sign in a new house, and that'll be those lessons for that year that the soul is working upon, in addition to the transiting Pluto in the natal chart. And they'll all go back to relate to the Pluto in the natal chart. Okay? We are not uncomplicated human beings. Okay? This makes sense with this? Okay, so now let's go on in your list to the second point in the formula. And this is where I'd like to bring in the nodes of the moon. And I'm not paying attention to time, honey, so you really got to remind me, all right? The nodal axis, we know it as the north node and the south node. And do you remember when we were working with some of our planetary definitions and I showed you this plane of the ecliptic? And I said once a month the moon would cross that ecliptic and go north, and that point where it did that was called the north node. And then 2 weeks later on the opposite side of the circle, the moon would cross the ecliptic going south, and that point was the south node. That's how those points are determined astronomically. And so all of us were born with the nodes of the moon opposite each other, north node, south node, all right? And the moon, as we remember, is our self-image, our emotional nature that is always changing, always adapting with everything that comes at us in our environment. Well, the south node of the moon is our emotional past. The north node of the moon is our emotional future, to just put it very succinctly, okay? South node's past, north node's future on an emotional level. So if we look at any of us, you know, no matter how we're going to describe ourselves, one of the things that we cannot get away from is our emotional nature. Even those of us who walk around thinking we're entirely in our heads, we're very much emotional souls. Evolutionary astrology states evolution takes place through the emotional body. You are not going to get away from your emotional nature. The closest astrological planet to the Earth is the moon. You all see how we're affected by the tides of the moon on a physical level. And just, to me, on a psychic level, there's no way we detach from our emotions. And so that nodal axis of the moon is always showing us how we're working to let go of the emotional past and work to move into an emotional future. So, because our souls are so emotionally based, you can also get this emotional basis to the soul from the fact that in the natural zodiac, Pluto rules Scorpio and the 8th house. It rules one of the water signs. So it has a lot of correlation on an emotional level from that area. So the next point we look at in the main karmic dynamic of a soul is the position of the south node. The south node of the moon, by house sign aspect, will give us the vehicle, the mode of operation that the soul operated through in past lives in order to work upon those past life lessons and in order to be secure. So that south node comes along and fills in details to wherever Pluto is by natal house sign aspect. So if we will go back here to this example of George Bush's chart, here's the south node. I call it the upside down horseshoes, or maybe it's the right side, whatever. But this is the south node. The little circles are on top and the curve, the horseshoey curve, is on the bottom. In George Bush's chart, the south node is a 20-degree Sag in the 5th house. So then we can start to blend together an emotional past in Sag in the 5th house. The 5th house is a natural Leo house. So you see some double emphasis here in fire. Sag is a fire sign. The 5th house is a fire house. And that fire is spirit. Remember the elements, the 4 elements, fire, air, earth, water. The fire is, the fire signs are spirit. Okay? So we can tell from an emotional basis in past lives, okay, this is a first house soul. Pluto and Leo generation first house. This is a me first soul. And I'm going to initiate what I want in my desire to explore myself. This is a soul who wants freedom, who wants to have the ability to just be totally in charge of their world. Aries, they want to lead. We add in this south node, and we have a soul, 5th house, again, Leo, fire signs. We also have just another huge emphasis of energy of a soul who believes they're right, Sag, who wants things to be their way, who wants to be center stage, Leo, the 5th house. This is a soul whose emotional nature, okay, and this is a soul who loves to be on stage. This is a soul who loves to be the center of attention. This is a soul who comes from past life orientations of wanting to be the leader, of wanting everybody to notice. This is a soul who's been working a number of lifetimes to get to be president, in whatever way he perceived it. You know, to me, you can take this back to the Roman days, and you know, we just wanted to be Caesar. You know, you just fast forward it to this particular area right now. So we look at this type of stuff, and this starts to fill in the blanks. All right, and so we start looking at the south node nature, and we have a soul who's going to get righteous, consensus state, who's going to get righteous whenever anybody wants to question them about their impulsiveness. Okay? This is a soul who's going to do whatever. You know, one of the things about Leo and the 5th house, when we have it in its unevolved states, in its unevolved awareness, is they will do Oh boy. It's like the child who will have the temper tantrum in order to get attention. If we don't know how to get attention from the parents in a positive way, we'll get it in a negative way. And so in consensus state, this is a soul who will create a lot of chaos, okay, in order to come in and save it. Does this make sense? Can you recognize this in view of the current situation with this? Okay, so we'll find again that South Node fills in details for this first house or for this natal Pluto as to how things will come out and operate, as to how things will take place. And then the next step to the formula in understanding the soul's past, where it's coming from, is to take the ruler of the South Node and add this into the formula. When the South Node is in Sag, the ruler of this South Node then is Jupiter, for Jupiter rules Sag. So then we can start to bring in that South Node ruler, Jupiter, by house and sign. Libra, third house. Okay? And the moon, you can start to see that the moon is balsamic this. It's only 2 degrees this. First of all, a South Node ruler in the third house. This is going to emphasize the energy. The third house is the Gemini house, it's communications. Jupiter is the planet of the right brain and intuition, okay? And Jupiter and Sag rule religion and spirituality and philosophy, okay? When we put Jupiter down here in the third house, in this formula right here, this is a soul who is going to say, Libra, third house, whatever needs to be said to appear to be right. If you've been watching some of what's been appearing in the media, have you watched how the story has changed to go after Iraq? I mean, this is, when you look at this fiery energy, this is a soul, first house Pluto soul, they can just get focused in that direction. And that South Node in Sag, they're focused in what they believe is right. And this Jupiter in Libra in the third house will change what we say to keep our focus however we want it. So our reasons, you know, I'm sure you can fill in the details. I've read it, you know, in some place in the newspaper a while back, where, you know, first of all there was the tie to Al-Qaeda, and then of course it was not following through on the weapons inspections, and then it was, we have all these chemicals of mass destruction and stuff. The reasons for going after Iraq changed depending upon whatever we needed to say. Libra is an air sign. Libra is a communicator. The third house is a communicator. Sometimes what we will have with the air signs is we talk and we say things however they need to be said to still make whatever point we want to make. Does this make sense? Again, I'm just using Bush as the example because he's in the news. We all know who he is right now. So you can start to see these planetary things. So you look at your ruler of the South Node and the South Node to fill in the details to the natal Pluto by house and sign. And those things combined together give you an idea of where the soul is coming from, which is where the soul will gravitate to, and how the soul will have a tendency to operate, especially early in life. And if you start working with souls in the individuated and spirituated state, as they go through life, they're going to start to gravitate to the polarities of those more and more, which are the last 3 points of the formula we'll go through. If we're working with souls in consensus state, they will have a tendency to keep reinterpreting these natal 3 points of the formula. Pluto by natal house sign aspect, South Node by house sign aspect, ruler of South Node by house sign aspect. Consensus state souls will keep gravitating back to that and wanting to reinterpret it again and again. Does this make sense for everybody? Okay. Let's work our way through the rest of the formula. Let's go on to the next point, okay? now let's start working, and we'll do this in George Bush's case. Let's start working in understanding the evolutionary intent of a soul. So after we start to gravitate this in a chart, and for those of you, some of you like to do some chart interpretations in this room, and some of you want to work to do your own clientele. I work with helping the students with homework in Jeffrey's correspondence course to be an evolutionary astrologer. And one of the things that I'm telling students and helping students understand when they first get started is go back to the basics of that formula. Go back to those 3 points again and again and again. And when it starts to get too much, adding in this planet, this sign, this house, start all over again and go back to the basics of that formula. And so sometimes when you're starting out and you're just looking at a chart, just let yourself ponder Pluto by sign and house, and ponder it for a day or two. And just think of everything you can think of by Pluto in that sign and Pluto in that house. And you can start to take some of those traditional tidbits in astrology and you let them mull around, so that you get some idea of being able to grasp the nature of that soul and what that soul gravitates to for security reasons. Then add in the south node. Then add in the ruler. And then start adding in the rest of the formula and just go back to the basics all the time. And sometimes if you take Pluto by sign, Pluto by house, south node sign, south node house, south node ruler sign and house, and you start listing what you know about those signs and houses, you'll start to see some characteristics, some words start to repeat themselves, and it'll start to come together, and you'll start to get some grasping of where the soul is coming from. Okay? You can go back and I always tell people, go back and simplify it. Go back and simplify it. Just go back to the beginning and start over again. And then after you spend some time pondering those 3 parts of the formula, then you can, if you want to, you can add in some of the other planets and see how they go into this. Okay, now we're going to do the opposite half of the formula, which is the evolutionary intent within the soul. And that's the last 3 parts to the formula. So then again, as I've said several times, we look to the opposite houses and signs of anything for information, for answers, completion, and balance. So now we're going to take the Pluto formula and we're going to go to the opposite points of every place we were with the main 3 things we talked about and look at the opposite. So we're going to look at, whenever we look at Pluto by natal house and sign aspect, it tells us where the soul is coming from. The polarity point is where the soul is going. So we look to the opposite sign, house, and then aspects to fill in as to where the soul's lessons are in this particular lifetime. Remember when we worked with the Pluto and Leo generation, it was a me first generation, very focused upon self. They have Aquarian lessons. They have lessons of learning objectivity. They have lessons of learning how to detach from the immediacy of self and to move into the whole picture and then find where they uniquely fit in to the whole picture, to the community at large. And so the Pluto in Leo generation, to use George Bush as an example, will many times have what we call Aquarian shocks and traumas to detach out of themselves, to see a larger picture, to have a broader understanding of something. And so if we look at this example right here with Bush again, and we look at a first house Pluto, the evolutionary intent of the soul is in relationships this lifetime. They're having to learn how to get out of self, first house, and move into relationships. And when we look at added on with this generation, we are looking at Aquarius in the 7th house of relationships. Aquarius rules the cusp of the 7th house. So we're having to learn how to detach from all of these relationships and see how we fit into this picture of relationships versus always wanting to impose ourselves upon all of the relationships that are in our life. Okay, this makes sense. Also, the 7th house will bring in the necessity to learn how to have equality in relationships. Anytime you see a first house Pluto soul, this is a soul, especially if it's consensus state. It will mean a soul who has had a build-up of karma in relationships. And it was easier to go off and be alone first house than to deal with relationships. It's easier to have the relationship inside their head with themselves than to go out and have actual relationships with other people. And so many times when you're dealing with this with other souls, with a first house Pluto, you will see them go through time periods of isolation and then time periods of relationships. And they'll bounce back and forth between the extremes instead of knowing how to have a balance of time alone and time in relationships. Now, when we look at it in George Bush's case, we have a much more magnified example. And so we're not only looking at his personal relationships and his political relationships. As a leader of our country, we're looking at his relationships with other countries. So anytime we have a political leader of a country, we can start to look at their chart as representing the chart of the country at whole at the current moment. And so what we have here, again, is Bush having to learn how to open up and relate to the leaders of other countries as an equal, as all countries being equal. And what we see happening here as we've been watching the news is we're seeing a president who, with his own personal energy, is then coming across and bringing this into the political arena and bringing out more of that United States being what they would call arrogant, being the one who's going to be on top. We're going to lead the charge. We're not going to learn how to work with anybody else. And yet these are his lessons. And so from time to time, with a first house Pluto soul, again, they'll have relationships, Pluto and Leo soul in the first house, they'll have this Aquarian shocks in relationships to get them to learn to relate as equals. So the opposite, the polarity point, shows where the soul is intending to grow in this lifetime. So for those of you who think, well, you got blank houses in your chart, there's always a planet opposite that blank house that's filling that blank house with energy. Question is just to go over there and look at it. Let's go back to this. Yes, Beth?
What about on his chart, his 4th and his 10th houses are both blank?
With both of them being blank, you'll have planets transiting through. You'll have the cusp of the 4th house is Libra. So you will have Venus ruling this 4th house, so it would be as if Venus was in this house. You have the cusp of the 10th house, you have Aries ruling that house. So you have Mars ruling Aries, it'd be as though Mars was in that house.
So nothing's ever truly empty. Okay.
Nope. We all have these 12 areas of life operating within inside ourselves. Yep. And to again work with the Pluto formula, I wanted to go back our earlier example when we looked at Pluto in the 4th house, and we had a soul who gravitated to all those emotional lessons and had all these emotional insecurities. The polarity point would then be the 10th house, and we would have a soul who would have to learn how to mature the 10th house and learn how to go out there and take care of themselves in the world, career. And that career would be built based upon how well they could heal their emotional lessons to go out there. Okay? So you can start to look at Pluto in any house, and it's the polarity house that will show them the lessons of what they're supposed to learn. So the basics of astrology is that polarity of manifestation and the polarity of the opposites to blend and find the whole. Okay, this makes sense? So that polarity point represents where the soul is intending to grow in this lifetime. It's the uncharted territory, all right? And the opposite of what I said earlier, the future, no matter how much we desire it, represents insecurity because it is unknown. Okay? So it's walking through the insecurity to walk into the future. Now, then we do the same thing with the rest of the formula. We look at the north node, which is opposite the south node. We look at the north node to add in details of how the soul's trying to grow emotionally in this lifetime and fulfill that polarity point of Pluto. So when we look at this particular example and we have a 7th house polarity point in Aquarius, we have the north node up here in Gemini in the 11th house. Remember what we said with the Pluto passing through Sag, the Gemini lesson was the relativity of truth? And so one of the things that this particular soul, George Bush, would have to realize with a north node in Gemini is that there's many ways of looking at a situation. And there's many different ways of learning how to communicate in relationships. And so here again, when we work with this 11th house, remember this is the Aquarius house. So we have Aquarius as the sign for the polarity point. And we have the 11th house where the north node sits. You're starting to see some Aquarius emphasis in this evolutionary intent. And the whole thing about Aquarius is to detach, is to decondition. And if we're in consensus state, security lies outside of ourselves. We don't know how to decondition. We've bought into the consensus, and in his case, leading the consensus. So we can have some pretty heavy-duty Aquarian shocks that have to come through in communicating with others to get us to recognize that other people have messages and voices as well. Okay? So there's this huge emphasis in a soul here being so caught up in their own beliefs, in their own righteousness, that it can take extremes of messages, Gemini, extremes from outside his world, Aquarius, to get him to detach, shock, wake up, hear what needs to be said. You know, one of the things that I read in the news, and I am someone who watches the news because the news is consensus state. And as I'm watching consensus state evolve, I always observe it through the news. So I don't ignore it. I look for the signs in that direction. And so one of the things that has been said in the news about George is it doesn't matter what question you ask him, he's made up his mind of what his answer is going to be, and that's what he's going to give you. When he did the press conference from the White House, when they issued the ultimatum to Saddam or something like that, it was about a week or so before. When you read what was said in the news afterwards, it was like it didn't matter what we asked him. He brought it all back down to this one little sound bite that, you know, time's up, we're going in. And that's that Pluto in the 1st house with that south node in the 5th house and Sag. Okay? And so then what it will tend to create is that he doesn't listen to these messages, North Node in Gemini, that come to him. And so we can ignore them for so long until all of a sudden they blow up and they get louder and louder. The thing you learn with Uranus, the ruler of Aquarius, and the 11th house is that the message is there, and when you don't listen to it, it gets louder and louder and louder until it explodes. And that's what it creates, again, what we read in the traditional astrology books as the lightning bolt, you know, as the shock that comes through that Aquarian energy. Okay? Now when we take the ruler of the North Node and add that in, this is Mercury. Here at 9 degrees Leo. Look at how Mercury is balsamic Pluto by 1 degree. So one of the messages that he is here, that his soul is intending in this lifetime, okay, is to start to really hear things from within the depth of his soul, so that he can hear all the different ways you can talk about things and understand the variety of ways to communicate and relate to other people. All right? Now I want to give you some other examples with this. I'm going to look at how this will work with George Bush in consensus state. Then I want to pretend this is not George's chart, and we're going to evolve it. Okay? So that we can get some idea of just how you can work with this energy. Because George is in this consensus state, okay, these messages that he gets with this, all right, when we look at this polarity points, all these polarity points, the 7th house polarity point, the lessons of the soul, the north node and the ruler of the north node, how those lessons are supposed to be worked out and heard, okay? In George's case, what will have a tendency to happen with Mercury, Balsamic, Pluto, the soul itself? And so the ruler of the north node is caught up in the soul's security. Okay? And so what George will have a tendency to do is keep reinterpreting things and hearing what he wants to hear. Yet relative to Mercury being Balsamic to Pluto, on some level, his soul is hearing this, something's not right, but he ignores it for security reasons. He ignores it, and so he literally sometimes has to shut off part of his brain and his thinking abilities, okay, and just come back to that focus on what he believes is right. Because if he allows himself to really open up and think, it'll put his world into chaos. It'll put his inner nature into chaos. So that consensus state, okay, just keeps reinterpreting it to come to the same answers. And for him, it will probably create a necessity for an intensity of shock from others, 7th house, with communications, North Node in Gemini. And he still may not even hear that. You know, another president would have heard some of the things that were being said over the last few months from other countries, and would have had an ability to recognize how the U.S. relations with other countries were going downhill. This gentleman cannot recognize it, cannot see it. Now, if we evolve this soul, and we evolve this soul up into the individuated state, again, with what's happened over the last few months, there would have been the shocking information coming through from others that they then would have said, wait a minute, do I want to continue to act in this way? Wait a minute, do I need to think before I act? Mercury Balsamic to Pluto. We have a soul who's not there yet. And as a matter of fact, this intensifies this particular soul to keep acting headstrong in that way. All right? This makes sense? Understanding this? If we evolve this soul up into the individuated state, okay, we have a soul who's at some point in life is going to start going, wait a minute, you know, sometimes I get people who really come through with some dynamite messages that really help me understand things better. Maybe I should listen once in a while to what these people actually have to tell me. See how you start to reinterpret the energy when you can work with evolving the evolutionary state of the soul, and you're working with the same planetary indicators. Does this make sense for everybody? Following through with what I'm saying in regards to this? Questions? Questions? We're doing okay? Zach?
I'm probably jumping ahead, but what happens if the North Node is conjunct Pluto?
Good. That was where I was going to go to next, but I was going to get to see if there was any questions first. So, any questions? Okay. Okay, we'll leave this for a little bit. We're going to go to some of the variations with the Pluto formula. Okay? And there's a couple of main ones that I'd like to go through. You know, what we looked at here with George Bush's chart is we had a chart where the nodes were not anywhere near Pluto. Well, sometimes we will have situations where we will have the nodes of the moon interacting with Pluto. For instance, what if a child is born and they have Pluto conjunct the south node? Or they have Pluto conjunct the north node, or they have Pluto square the nodal axis. That puts variations into the Pluto formula. So the first one we'll look at is if a soul has Pluto conjunct the south node. When Pluto is conjunct the south node, and by the way, let me just qualify this. I'm going to use it in terms of Pluto, but you can also use it with other planets. So I'm going to work with Pluto conjunct the south node, but if you have a planet conjunct the south node, then you can interpret that planetary energy the same way. Okay? So when you have Pluto conjunct the south node, there's three possible conditions that can exist. First of all, that soul can be in a karmic repeat situation, a repetitious situation. When Pluto's conjunct that south node, that soul, when you look at it in a particular house, okay, let's say we have Pluto up here in the 9th house, and we have it conjunct the south node in the 9th house. Pluto in the 9th house would be a soul that would have lessons in most recent past lives concerning their belief systems. Religion in the consensus state, learning how to move into spirituality if they were in the individuated state, and learning how to break free from that stuff in the individuated and spirituated state. A 9th house Pluto soul would want to have their belief system all figured out so that they could feel secure. If we put the south node in there, it meant that they didn't figure it out from the most previous lives, and Pluto conjunct the south node, there was something that they either had to relive and redo it all over again, or the second condition, it could be a fruition. It could be something that was coming to bear fruit because of all the energy they put into it from past lives. Or the third condition to this, the most common, is that it could be a combination of relive and fruition. So when Pluto's conjunct the south node, that means there's a lot of stuff from the past by Pluto's house and sign that signifies it's not, there's something to redo, there's something to relive, or there's something that's ready to come into fruition. Following this? And usually what you can do is look at those planetary indicators, and when you're working with the soul, you'll see that it's an area of life that they just can't quite get it right, which means they're having to relive it. They're having to redo it again. Or you look at those indicators and that soul just seems to be especially gifted in that area, which means that, again, it's fruition. They're bringing it out because it's something that their soul just already knows. Or, again, the most common is that it's a combination of relive and fruition. In other words, some parts of it, they just can't get together, and other parts of it, they seem to just be coming through with some special messaging and some special energy. So if you take a planet conjunct the south node, that planet can have those three types of conditions with that planetary energy. And then the sign in the house fill in the details for you. Okay? Following? Now let's flip it. Let's have Pluto conjunct the north node. Okay? Instead of Pluto conjunct the south node, we have Pluto conjunct the north node. Let's go back to this 9th house example. We have Pluto in the 9th house. Okay? And we have Pluto conjunct the north node. When Pluto's conjunct the north node, that means there's one condition. It means the soul is meant to continue learning lessons in that house that's represented, and the polarity point does not come in to the picture, at least not until later on in life. or there's planets conjunct the south node. Then that will cause mitigating factors that you have to take into consideration. But when you see a soul that has Pluto conjunct the north node in a particular house and sign, it means they've been coming from that spot in their life's lessons, their soul's lessons in past lives, and they're meant to continue in that direction. Okay? For instance, I can think of a client of mine recently who had Pluto conjunct the north node in the 4th house. And so there was a whole bunch of emotional lessons that they've come in to learn, and they're supposed to keep growing in that direction of learning those emotional lessons via that 4th house. The polarity point of that 10th house did not come into the picture. There were no planets conjunct that south node. You could go to that south node up there in the 10th house, and you could tell from the past they kept wanting to put the energy into career, and they were supposed to put it into their own emotional growth and their home and family. Following? These are some of the variations. Okay? Now here's the most interesting variation for me to Pluto, and one that I don't always see Pluto square the nodal axis, but almost every chart, the exception is to not find it, but there's almost always planets square the nodal axis in a person's chart. And because, we've got 10 planets to have an opportunity with. I'm going to talk about Pluto square the nodal axis. And what that means is, say for instance you have a north node and a south node, and you have Pluto halfway between. Okay, so in George Bush's case, north node Gemini, south node Sag, if he had Pluto in Pisces, it would be square. If he had Pluto in Virgo, it would be square. When Pluto square the nodal axis, or any planet square the nodal axis, it means they're skipped steps that are direct within that soul. And it means that you look at the south node, the north node, and the soul has bounced back and forth between those two, but it has not been able to go A, B, C, D, this lesson, this lesson, this lesson. It's skipped steps. And now, here is what we would call the trickiest part to this, all right? In astrology, you have to figure out which node Pluto is applying to figure out how to resolve those skipped steps. So in my bag back there is my black marker, if you could give it to me. Because the nodes move retrograde for the most part, when we're trying to figure out what planet, what node Pluto is applying to, we go backwards. When we're trying to figure, if you got a Pluto square the nodal axis or a planet square the nodal axis, you go backwards to figure out, no, in the white bag that I brought everything in, when you would go backwards in that situation. Thank you, honey. Appreciate it. So let me give you, this one I just want to give you some example here with this. Okay, this is my nice 12 houses, okay? Let's make it a little easy on ourselves. Let's put Pluto up here in this 9th house, okay? And let's go down here and we're going to put the south node in the 6th house. We're going to put the north node in the 12th house, okay? And we'll go back here to this Pluto at 10 Leo, okay? And so that means we're going to put the south node at 10 Taurus, and we're going to put the north node at 10 Scorpio, okay? So we can see that Pluto is equally square both nodes. That means skipped steps. It means the soul skipped lessons, all right? When we're looking at what node Pluto is applying to, you remember the houses went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They went counterclockwise, okay? Well, because the nodes go retrograde out there and they're following the ecliptic, we go clockwise when we want to see which node Pluto's applying to, or any other planet. So in this case, this ninth house Pluto that's been trying to learn these lessons of philosophy and their security is caught up in their belief system being right, they have the third house polarity lessons of relativity of truth and learning how to open up to other belief systems. Well, they've got these two nodes, square Pluto. Pluto goes clockwise to the south node. So it's going back to the past, back to the south node to figure out the resolution between these two. Okay? If it was the opposite, and this was the north node, and this was the south node, Pluto would be applying to the north node. And we would go to the north node to figure out how to resolve the skipped steps. Just as you look at a planet square the nodal axis in your chart, you will go clockwise to that nearest node, and that node becomes the bottom line in resolving the skipped steps, in resolving the conflict. With me in regards to the math, just how you find it, okay? Do you want an example with interpretation for us? You want me to use some example here? Let's just say we have a soul in the individuated state. So this is a ninth house Pluto soul. They would have spent most recent past lives trying to find out different belief systems. So they could have spent a lifetime as a Buddhist, you know, a lifetime as a Christian, even a lifetime as a born-again Christian. They could have had different belief systems. And they could come in this lifetime having different belief systems that they were orientated to, trying to figure out their picture of the truth. And what will happen with a ninth house Pluto at any evolutionary state, sooner or later their belief system becomes limiting, and they will have a third house message, communication from others that pops their beliefs, that pops that bubble in their belief systems, and they have to open up to a larger way of looking at things. Okay? So if we wanted to, because we don't want to be confused, let's cross this one out and let's work with the latest example. So if we add on the nodal axis, okay, and we had a ninth house Pluto with the south node in the 12th house in Scorpio, boy, this is someone who may have been in a convent or a monastery, 12th house, or Scorpio. They could have been very righteous and, you know, very manipulative to others in having their beliefs met. Okay? This could also be something with the north node in the 10th house. So when we have a planet or Pluto square the nodal axis, both nodes will give us information to the past, both will give us information to the future. So when we look at this north node over here in the 6th house in Taurus, north node in the 6th house, this is someone who has some desire to purify themselves, okay? Yet there's some limitations, Taurus, into how they're trying to purify. In other words, they may clean up their belief systems according to how they feel comfortable, but not necessarily going all the way. If we put this nodal axis in Scorpio, Taurus, 6th house, 12th house, 6th house, the Virgo house, the Pisces house. If we start moving in Scorpio and Taurus, the two signs of the zodiac with sexuality, we can at a glance tell that this is a soul whose beliefs are confused about sexuality. And they don't quite know what to believe. They don't know how. They've taken sexuality and spirituality, and there's a huge wall in between this. There's skip steps. So what we could have here, okay, is a soul who could put on this purified face while at another point being very sexually promiscuous and not letting anybody find out about it. Okay? Following this? And so sooner or later there'd be something that would crash these beliefs to get the soul, again, Pluto applying to the north node, to get the soul to go in and face some type of crisis, 6th house. Oh my God, Taurus, they caught AIDS. Okay, follow how these kind of symbols work to see this? And so it gets them to then really look at this purifying. So then it gets them to bounce back over to the south node and go, wait a minute, I have to, on a very deep Scorpio level, really find out my relationship with the source. And I have to learn how to spiritualize my sexual relationships. And I have to be real with it and practice what's real, 6th house. Okay? All right? If this was a consensus state soul and they caught AIDS with this type of a situation, they could crucify themselves horrendously. They could have a lot of outer judgment and criticisms from the family. They could have it in the individuated and spirituated state. But if they moved up into the individuated state, there would be a lot of this reflection of what's wrong with this picture? What have I got to figure out? And the soul would be inclined towards searching for the truth and the beliefs. And if they were in the spirituated state, they could look at some disease like that as really helping them click into getting it spiritually. And they could even have some abilities to heal themselves by their ability to connect in to the source. See how you start to follow this when you have the different evolutionary states? Okay? So, and again, you use the same example when it's another planet that's squaring the nodal axis. If this was Mercury squaring the nodal axis, it would emphasize all of the communications. Okay? If it was the Sun squaring the nodal axis, it would emphasize the whole personality. Moon squaring the nodal axis, it would be all the emotional steps. Okay? The variations are as endless as we are individuals. Questions? Any questions with what I'm saying? You always compare the faster moving planet to the slower moving planet going counterclockwise like the numbers do. The exception is that when it's comparing any planet to the nodal axis, you go counterclockwise. So even if a planet is not square the nodal axis, if you're wanting to compare any of your planets to the north node to see how you're moving forward with growing emotionally, you take that planet and you go clockwise till you get to the north node. And if we use this north node in the 6th house and you have a planet in the 4th house, you go clockwise, 300 degrees around the chart to figure out the phasal relationship that planet is into the north node in regards to figuring things out. Okay? Questions? Any questions with this? Okay. Zach, yes?
Out of one. What about Mars? Square the nodal axis or something. Isn't that a special case or something?
What about Mars square the nodal axis? It'd be the same thing as Pluto or any other planet square the nodal axis. When you have Mars square the nodal axis, there's skipped steps in the soul acting upon its desires. And they'd bounce back and forth between the two extremes of the nodes, and yet it wouldn't be congruent. Okay, it wouldn't, what happens when we have planets square the nodal axis is those two nodes will give us extremes of behavior or extremes of examples, and yet we've not made this progression from the past to the future, or we've not made the progression from one extreme of behavior to the other. Okay, all right. And like in this example here, the common example would be someone who is just totally walls up towards sexuality, or the extreme of lots of sexual promiscuity and not knowing how to have that balance of healthy sexuality in between. If we take it into our beliefs, we could have the extreme of fundamentalism, versus some extremes of spirituality, yet not knowing completely how to bring it all into balance, not knowing how to walk the talk in every way spiritually.
Like certain Christian out in public, they were preaching one thing and they were practicing.
Exactly.
Jerry Falwell.
Exactly. The sexual scandals of the Catholic priests, perhaps not all of them because it's an overall picture, but we probably would have definitely had a few of those priests with some planets square the nodal axis that would have the sexuality symbols in there. That could have been the case. But that scandal is part of a larger picture of what we call patriarchal conditioning on the planet today. And the whole thing about patriarchal conditioning is that we have removed ourselves from natural spiritual laws and principles. And so that brings up the larger picture. Just as a tidbit for those of you, because we've been talking about evolutionary astrology, evolutionary astrology has a whole philosophy of creation based upon evolution. And so there's a whole philosophy that we had this huge shift from matriarchal principles of energy to patriarchal principles of energy between 6,000 and 7,000 BC. And what created that shift was man realizing he was co-creator with women of making babies. Up until that point, women were the first goddess. They were naturally worshipped because they grew these fat bellies and gave birth. They created life, and we didn't know how it happened. It was pretty magical. And when this realization happened between 6,000 and 7,000 BC, all of a sudden we had an evolution from the communal family unit to the individual family unit, and we had to know who we had sex with in order to know who our children were. So we started controlling the woman to control the sex, to control the children, the land, the money, and we eventually created the sky gods and the formalized religions. And whether you look at Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, the three major religions in the world today, whether you look at Eastern philosophies or Western philosophies, they have all universally evolved then over the last 9,000 years now. They've all universally evolved to separating sexuality from spirituality. The Garden of Eden myth, is the symbol in Christianity doing just that. Women became flesh, became sin. Man became saint, became perfect. See the inequality to this. And so the whole Garden of Eden myth is separating sexuality from spirituality. Whereas when you look at natural spiritual laws and principles, sexuality is a natural part of life. It's a natural part of law. Sexuality is the most sacred act there is when you work with natural spiritual laws and principles. You look at the whole reason of the unmanifest manifesting, that's God, goddess making love to itself, the whole act of creation. So we have so distorted natural sexuality that today's world we don't even recognize it. It's only been in what? Somebody help me out. The last 500 years or so that Catholic priests were supposed to be celibate? When was it brought about?
1100.
1100. Excuse me. 900 years. So it hasn't always been that way. So, and any time you try and take natural laws and you distort them, when you distort them, then they get suppressed and they just come out other ways. And that's why we look at all of the distortion we have with natural sexuality. I mean, one of the things that archaeology has proven is that there were no wars, rapes, murders on the planet until the shift from matriarchy to patriarchy principles. And again, it's when we started distorting from natural laws and creating these human-made conditions and laws, etc., that this started happening. Okay? Just briefly, because we're running out of time, I'll give you some other closing tidbits in regards to evolutionary astrology's philosophy about spirituality. Is over the last, 8,000 to 9,000 years, our human-made religions have taught us three conditioned beliefs. Conditioned. God is male, God is outside of us judging us, and God is perfect. This flies in the face of natural spiritual laws and principles which teach us the universal source is God, Goddess. It's beyond gender, it's both gender. The universal source is inside us. You find it nowhere out there till you have it in here first. And the real biggie is that the universal source is an evolving force. Think about it. Why would something perfect create this mess? The universal source is an evolving force. The entire reason the unmanifested manifested is because it's a great evolutionary experiment. And so when you look at the universal source being evolving just like us, you can become more compassionate. As you can realize the most evolved souls on the planet are still in the process of evolving, just like all of us. Because we were taught to believe that God was perfect, and we've been conditioned, especially in the Piscean age of the last 2,000 years, of believing that we're imperfect, we have been conditioned to believe in this guilt of imperfection. We have two responses to this guilt. One response to the guilt is atonement. I must suffer. I have to be punished. I'm not worthy of it. I have to work really hard. That is the energy of victimization and extreme masochism. The other response to the guilt is anger. How dare they punish me? How dare they judge me? How dare they hurt me? I'm going to lash out at them before they get me. It's the energy of victorization, and in its extremes is sadism. Sadomasochism stems directly from your human-made religions. And so when we start to understand this type of stuff, we can learn to recognize how some of this conditioning has been happening within our souls just in the last 2,000 years of the Piscean age, and how it can take some effort to break free from it. And one of the great things about the transitions between ages, as we're transitioning during this 300 to 500 year time period, take your pick when the date is, from the Piscean age to the Aquarian age, whenever there's a transition in the great years, the precession of the ages, whenever there's transitions between ages, that's the point in time when things get so shook up in humanity that we can break free from the past. And there are many of us in the Pluto and Virgo generation and the Pluto and Leo generation who've incarnated specifically during these times to try and change things in the chaos, in the transition of the ages. So,